Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the first of the speaker series of the Lacan Salon. My name is Hilda Fernandez. I'm a founder member of the Lacan Salon and co-president at the moment with my friend Sanem Gouvenc. We are absolutely thrilled to have Dany Nobus as our first speaker. We have to tell you and remind you that in 2011, we have the first La conference in the Lacan Salon, and Dany Nobus was our keynote. So it's a pleasure. It's sort of inaugural thing. We want to remind you to keep the speaker in silence, please. And we are going to have this conversation. I'm going to turn into Sanem in a minute so she can introduce Dany properly. I just want to also acknowledge that we are in Vancouver, Canada. The Lacan Salon lives here, and this is on ceded territories of the ancestral peoples of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples of this land. And we want to acknowledge that, and also welcome everyone. And we're going to have a series of these lectures every month. Keep in tune, send us an email to be on top of this information. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass the mic to my friend Sanem to introduce Dany. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda, very much. As the co-chair of the Lacan Salon, I also welcome everyone. If you have like two chairs or co-chair system, you're welcome twice. Into any event, apparently. I welcome everyone to this inaugural talk of the newly minted Lacan Salon speaker series. Starting with today's talk, first Saturday of every month, we'll be hosting analysts and scholars from the wider Lacanian world. And here with us today is Francine Dagneau. She'll be speaking next month on her clinical work with refugees. We're very much looking forward to that, and we have also other like scholars and analysts lined up. And there are so many more novelties, by the way, to the Lacan Salon, in addition to the speaker series, because there's a new board since last April, and I can say that definitely a very renewed energy. So please check our website at lacansalon.com. and continue to follow us on Twitter and Eventbrite, where almost all of these events will be announced from. Without further ado, allow me to introduce Dany Nobus, who definitely needs no introduction, but I will do so anyways. Dany Nobus is Professor of Psychoanalytic Psychology at Brunel University London, founding scholar of the British Psychoanalytic Council, and former chair and fellow of the Freud Museum London. He has published extensively, he's such a prolific author, extensively on history, theory, and practice of psychoanalysis, the intersections between psychoanalysis, philosophy, and the arts. I would highly suggest you read his amazing articles on Francis Bacon if you haven't already. Fascinating. Maybe we will have Dany over for another conversation about like art and clinical practice, maybe sometime in the future. He has published on the history of ideas with special reference to the Renaissance and early modern periods. His recent books include Critique of Psychoanalytic Reason, Studies in Lacanian Theory and Practice, that came out from Routledge in 2022, Thresholds and Pathways between Jung and Lacan, on the Blazing Sublime, which is co-edited with Casement, and Phil Gross, which came out from Routledge in 2020, and The Law of Desire on Lacan's Kant with Sade, from Palgrave, 2017. In 2017, he was the recipient of the Sarton Medal of the University of Ghent for his outstanding contributions to psychoanalytic historiography. And he is currently working on a new in-depth biography of Jacques Lacan. And today we will be taking a glimpse at that biography partially through his talk. Last year I attended a talk given by Dany where he was in conversation with Daniel Tutt. It was a two-part conversation, and it was fascinating, and something he said there stuck with me ever since. Dany, you said Lacan was always elsewhere, and I guess he is here with us today through your presentation and the new archival material. And Dany, on behalf of the Lacan Salon, I would like to say thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's truly an honor and definitely a pleasure to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sanem. The first thing I will do is to share my screen so that we can get that out of the way. I trust that you can see the PowerPoint. Can you just give me the nod?
Yes, we can see it, Dany.
Yeah.
Yes.
See the PowerPoint? Excellent. Well, thank you, Sanem, and thank you, Lacan Salon in Vancouver, for inviting me, albeit via Zoom. I will nonetheless try to establish some kind of rapport, so that we have a good discussion afterwards. It is also an honor and pleasure for me to be able to open this new series of lectures. And as Sanem said in her introduction, I'm currently working on a new in-depth biography of Lacan. So some of the ideas that I will present emanate from my archival work, but I will nonetheless try and demonstrate that historical archival research can still be relevant for contemporary issues, in this case, about the transmission of psychoanalysis. In October 1967, Lacan was invited to give a lecture at the Internat du Vinatier, which is now called Centre Hospitalier in Lyon, by its then director Jean-Paul Chartier. It was one of a great many invitations that Lacan received following the publication of Écrit on 15 November 1966. And if Lacan himself is to be believed, it was the kind of invitation that, although he accepted them, didn't particularly please him all that much, because he generally felt that the audience was not sufficiently well versed for him to carry on with what he had been doing in Paris, that is to say, an extension of his seminar, or in other words, Lacan felt that these invitations generally came with an expectation for him to explain his own trajectory. And Sanem earlier on said that one of the things that came out of my work on Lacan, the man, the psychoanalyst, the father and the lover, is that he was always already elsewhere. One of the other things that came out of my work is that he generally hated looking backwards. Lacan was determined to always take matters forward, which probably also explains as to why the 25 odd seminars, public seminars that he delivered between 1953 and 1980 always contain something new and rarely include a recapitulation of earlier work. But look, with these invitations, as I said, he felt that the expectation was always for him to look backwards, which was not his cup of tea, really. In any case, in October 1967, Lacan gave a talk called The Place, Origin, and End of My Teaching. End here, obviously, to be interpreted as aim or objective. It's a talk that, as you will see in a minute, I will take as a springboard for developing an argument about the transmission of psychoanalysis. It's a talk that hasn't been commented on all that much, maybe because it's generally not considered to be a particularly important element of Lacan's work, but I think it does contain some interesting material, as I will try to demonstrate. Apart from this talk, the visit that Lacan paid to Lyon on that day in October 1967 is also interesting because it was Lacan's first in-person meeting with Gilles Deleuze, which I will not talk about today because that would be the topic of another lecture, but so at that point, Deleuze was teaching at the University of Lyon, hadn't published all that much. I think he'd only published an introduction to Venus in Furs by Sacher-Masoch, so all his major books were still to come, but he gladly attended Lacan's talk. By the way, if you're interested in the text of the talk, it is available both in French and in English. In English, the volume was published in 2008 as the first text in a small book called My Teaching. If you want to know more about Lacan's encounter with Deleuze, then I recommend that you have a look at the monumental double biography by François Doss on Deleuze and Guattari. Now, in the talk that Lacan gave at Lyon, he first of all argued, and this is a quote that I project on the screen and that I will read out to you. He first of all argued that the origin is not what comes first, that what comes first is actually the place. The argument from a structuralist point of view, of course, should not surprise you in the sense that it is a staple of structuralist thinking that all the questions of origin can only be answered in a mythological or in a mythical sense. But so Lacan argued, quote, in the beginning there was not the origin, there was the place. Place means something very different here from what it means in topology. It simply means the place I've come to and which puts me in a position to teach. You occupy the place where an act pushes you, and as far as my place is concerned, things go back to the year 1953, unquote. Now, the ellipses in the quote mean that I actually deleted a few observations because I didn't consider them to be directly relevant. But you can obviously read the entire quote in the book that I showed earlier on. This particular quote already raises a number of questions I think that are worth exploring. The first one is that, well, this is an observation more than a question. The first one is that, well, just because the place precedes the origin, or just because the origin can only be answered as a question in a mythological sense, doesn't mean that one cannot trace the origin of the place. Okay, so so Lacan is not particularly contradicting himself, but at the same time doesn't stop himself from actually attaching a clear date, and in this case it's a year, namely 1953, to the time when his teaching effectively started. which is the second observation, i.e. that in 1967, for Lacan, his place as a teacher started in 1953. And quite interestingly, if you look at the talk or the transcription at least, which we have to deem to be accurate. I haven't found the recording, but I assume it's fairly accurate. But he didn't actually talk, and that's what I will talk about to some extent today. He didn't talk about how the place he came to occupy afterwards, particularly as a result of what happened, and I will talk about that in a minute, in 1963, changed quite dramatically. So the second observation is that he offered his audience a glimpse of how, as a result of an act, he came to the position of a teacher in 1953, but he didn't say anything about what happened afterwards. The third observation, and that's also where I will start, so in a sense, that's the origin of my talk here today. The third observation is that for strange reasons, Lacan, in 1967 at least, didn't consider his position before 1953 as to be that of a teacher. It's strange because before 1953, and I will go through this for the sake of time fairly quickly, before 1953, that is to say before the start of his public seminars, we know for a fact that in various forms and on various occasions, Lacan did occupy the place of someone who transmitted knowledge or who questioned, in some cases, existing psychoanalytic knowledge. For example, we know that between December 1951 and February 1953, he gave 3 lectures to the Société Psychanalytique de Paris under the general title Psychanalyse dialectique, ? So is there such a thing as dialectical psychoanalysis? The text, and I apologize if what I say comes across as slightly presumptuous. It's not meant to be presumptuous, let alone arrogant. Because I'm always happy to share, as Sanem knows, not only my slides, but other materials as well. The text of these 3 lectures was deemed lost until recently, but I have managed to find 2 manuscripts of about 40-odd pages each, handwritten manuscripts, that clearly informed the lectures. The first one here, I'm not going to comment on, but what you see there underlined indicates that it's clearly related to those lectures. So the first 3 words are les 3 cours, the 3 courses, and the second line that is underscored is la psychanalyse entend quelle est fonction dialectique. There's a second manuscript that is also about 45 pages long, and as you can see at the top, again, what it's about is la fonction dialectique de la psychanalyse, l'expérience de la Q, le sens du transfert, etc. There's a trace of these lectures in a text in the Écrit that Bruce Fink translated as Presentation on Transference. You have the reference there, and unlike many other texts in the Écrit, this one is actually quite accessible. And the reason why it is quite accessible is probably because it stems from an improvised intervention commentary that Lacan made at a conference of the SPP. It's also quite accessible because the text, for those of you who have read it, you will notice the text is actually to a large extent a rereading, and I should probably emphasize a dialectical rereading of Freud's Case of Dora. But in my research, I've actually also found evidence of the fact that this particular text, which was written in 1951, is not just about Freud's Dora, but also about another Dora, i.e. it's also about Dora Maar. Dora Maar, who was in analysis with Lacan for a number of years during the late 1940s, after she had a serious breakdown following the breakup with Picasso. So this is the first example of what Lacan was doing before 1953, but interestingly, he didn't consider it to be worthy enough to be called a place of teaching. We, of course, also know that before 1953, he gave a series of private seminars at his home, which was just next door and still is just next door to his practice room, on Freud's case studies of Dora, the Wolfman, and the Ratman. The notes on the Wolfman were published by Jacques Lacan in 2021 in a book called Aux confins du séminaire, which, for those of you who don't speak French, I can already say will be translated and published next year in English by Polity. The seminar on the Ratman fed into a text that was published in 1979, which some of you may have read, called The Neurotic's Individual Myth. And what is actually interesting is, and again, I've underlined it there, is that at the very beginning of the text, Lacan actually refers to what he was doing as teaching or as a seminar, which again makes it all the more interesting as to why he would not consider whatever he was doing before 1953 as a position of teaching. I'll give you two other examples. The first example, and again, this was not known at all until I found it, but during the late 1940s and until well into the 1950s, Lacan gave at least 2 lectures every year to the Collège Philosophique at the invitation of Jean Wahl. For those of you who can't read what I've highlighted there in red, you will see that it's to the left of your screen that in March 1951, Lacan gave a lecture called La fin du moi, the end of the ego. But there was another one in December 1953. There was one in February 1954. Again, the text, the manuscript of these lectures, and there's loads of them. It's completely forgotten, but all in all, there's about 10 of them. The text and manuscript was deemed lost until I found it in the archives. But again, I'm only showing this to you to illustrate that it's not that Lacan was inactive before 1953. And then the final example, of course, is his presentation at the First World Congress of Psychiatry, 1950, where you see Lacan and Melanie Klein, because that's Melanie Klein in the picture to your left. Lacan and Melanie Klein being in the same space or in the same place, but not in the same picture. All this to say, my friends, that as I said, Lacan wasn't exactly idle before 1953, which raises the question as to why in 1967 he did not consider his numerous interventions prior to 1953 as stemming from a place of teaching. It's a question that I think deserves to be asked precisely because in Lyon, Lacan was so specific and singled out 1953 as the origin of the place. There are various ways in which you could answer that question. I mean, a first answer could be that he didn't single out his work before 1953 as worthy of consideration because those interventions were not delivered in a formal capacity. That is to say, they were not delivered by someone who was given or who took the authority of a teacher. The second possible answer is that the interventions were not part of a series, although, of course, that doesn't really apply to the private seminars on Freud's Dora, the Ratman and the Wolfman, of course. But fair enough, you could say that many of the interventions were standalone rather than lecture courses. The third possible answer is that the content may not have warranted Lacan's subsequent retroactive interpretation of these interventions as teaching. All of these answers have some validity, but I think the real reason is this one. I think the real reason as to why Lacan singled out 1953 as the origin of the place, as the start of his work of teaching, is because the interventions before 1953 were not part of and didn't have the ambition to contribute to a psychoanalytic training program. This is true both for the private seminars, it is true for the interventions at the Collège Philosophique, it is true for the interventions on dialectical psychoanalysis at the Société Psychoanalytique de Paris. It is true for everything I just showed you from the years before 1953. Now, to teach as part of a psychoanalytic training program means that you teach in a different way. And the difference is not only to do with the position of the teacher or the position of the agency, and I'm not going to talk too much about the theory of the four discourses, but you should feel free to ask me about Lacan's own discursive position when he taught with a view to transmitting psychoanalysis as part of a psychoanalytic training program. But so it depends on the certain position of the teacher, the agency, but it also depends on the position of the other or of the audience, if you want. And it is indeed the case that when Lacan delivered his private seminars at his home, that his audience were not exclusively or primarily trainees. It was a small group of people that had heard about Lacan and wanted to be there in order to take part in the discussion. And again, in the course of my work, I discovered some interesting facts that remained previously unknown. For example, I'll just give you one little snippet. For example, that one of the attendees of Lacan's private seminars during the early 1950s was none other than Michel Foucault. So, so Foucault, who obviously didn't train as a psychoanalyst, was in a sense already there when he was himself finishing his degree in psychology. So the upshot is that the three first hypothetical answers, I think, are not as valid as the one that I highlighted there, because when Lacan talks about teaching, what he has in mind is a specific form of teaching. What he has in mind is a position or a place from which a fundamental aspect of psychoanalytic training can be transmitted. Now, in 1967, Lacan had not yet formulated his theory of the four discourses. That would only come 2 years later in Seminar 17 on the other side of psychoanalysis. But in 1967, and I invite you to reread the texts and the seminar that was being delivered in Paris around the same time. But in 1967, Lacan is already aware of what does constitute a certain paradox, or at least what constitutes an insuperable issue, which I will illustrate, and it's a bit of an anachronism because I said he didn't have the theory of the four discourses yet, but I will illustrate it with the theory of the four discourses. The paradox or the issue is that insofar as the teacher occupies a position of knowledge, as it is the case in the discourse of the university, then how on earth does your teaching aim at transmitting knowledge that is supposed to be in the position of truth, which in this case means in a position of failure? Or in other words, if you occupy a position of teacher and your ambition is to transmit knowledge, how on earth do you actually teach what fundamentally escapes knowledge, that is to say, the object A? So you can ask me more questions about that in the discussion if you want, but as I said, even before Lacan invented the theory of the four discourses, he was already fully aware of this paradox. How does one teach what escapes knowledge? How does one teach what, in a sense, cannot be taught? You already find this, by the way, during the 1950s in various other sources. What I'm showing you here, and don't worry, I will not read out the letter, I will only highlight one phrase of this letter to show you that this paradox was very much on Lacan's mind. This is a letter that Lacan sent to Suzanne Delorme, who was the secretary of the Société Française de Philosophie, another organization where Lacan was a regular guest. And in this letter, Lacan insists that the text that is about to be published, and we know what the text is, I will show it to you in a couple of seconds. So he insists that the text starts with it being highlighted how what psychoanalysis teaches the analysand, how that can be taught, how that can be transmitted on, how that can be relayed to the next generation of analysts, if you want. So what I've highlighted there in red reads la psychanalyse, ce qu'elle enseigne, ce qu'elle nous enseigne, comment l'enseigner. Psychoanalysis, what it teaches us, how to teach it. Which is effectively the question underpinning the text that is in the écrit. And again, you know, it's a text that is not often commented on. It's kind of generally considered to be one of Lacan's minor texts, but I don't think this is the case at all, precisely because it is a text in which Lacan, long before he invented the discourse theory, highlights this paradox of how do you teach what escapes knowledge. By the way, I should also mention that the text is published in écrit, and I can only hold Lacan responsible for that, was published without the discussion. And the discussion is almost as interesting as the text itself, if only because during the discussion, Maurice Merleau-Ponty and others respond to Lacan's paradoxes in ways that are quite interesting. It was only published in 1985 in Ornicart as Dialogue avec les philosophes français. Now, if you take Lacan's word for it, and you do indeed consider the origin of the place as 1953, because that's when Lacan started adopting the position of someone who was contributing to the transmission of psychoanalysis, then you cannot ignore the fact that in the space of 10 years, this place itself changed quite dramatically. And I'm not sure it changed dramatically because of the paradox that I highlighted earlier on. I think it changed for institutional, if not to say for institutional and personal reasons, that rather than for reasons to do with the, I feel like saying the impossibility of teaching psychoanalysis, right? But it changed because during the early years, Lacan's position was very much that of a seminar leader. You know, if you look at how Lacan's seminar was announced in the journal La Psychanalyse, then you see, and again, I won't talk about that extensively, but you see that a difference was made between what they called les cours magistraux, so the magisterial courses on the one hand, and the text seminars, and that Lacan's contribution was not filed under the magisterial courses, but it was described as a text seminar, which means, and you get that when you read seminar 1 and to some extent seminar 2, what you get is very much, and Lacan also mentions it at the very beginning, is very much a collaborative, a participatory environment in which the attendees not just sit passively absorbing knowledge, but actively contribute to the development of the ideas. But over the years, it changed, you know. So from a seminar leader, within the space of 2 years, he became a course convener. You know, if you look at how the year 1955-1956 was announced, then immediately you see that the séminaire de texte, the text seminar has gone. You know, fair enough, the magisterial courses have gone too, but everything now falls under the same heading. And again, you can see this if you read the seminars from seminar 3 onwards, that the atmosphere of active participation and discussion is no longer there in the same way as it was there during the early years. So from a collaborative enterprise, it very much became what in Latin is called an ex cathedra form of teaching, where the teacher, in this case Lacan, adopts the formal position of the teacher, and the audience is there as the passive recipients of whatever knowledge is passed on. But towards the end of the 1950s, and I do apologize for throwing in some more Latin, but it is a good phrase, I think. Towards the late 1950s, it wasn't just an ex cathedra position, it was also a position of Lacan being the primus inter pares, which means the one amongst equals. That is to say, the first, the one whose teaching was considered to be much more important than that of many other people in the Société Française de Psychanalyse. That's probably why no one talks about the seminars of Daniel Lagache, right? Or why no one talks about the seminars of Juliette Favez-Boutonnier, right? No one talks about them because those seminars were considered, and I'm going to use a strong word, inferior to Lacan's seminar, which had acquired in the space of 10 years the quality and the reputation of being the most important one. Needless to say, it was balanced against others. Lacan was not the only teacher, and Lacan's position at the time was also balanced against a clinical position of his being an analyst or his being a supervisor. Again, I'm not going to develop that point in any great detail, but I have found, and I'm not going to elaborate on that, but I have found, for example, very detailed information about who was in analysis with whom, for how long and for how many sessions. So here, this is Didier Anzieux, and you can see that he was in analysis with Lacan between January 1949 and March 1953. I should have highlighted it also in red, perhaps, at a rate of 3 sessions per week, right? Here is the example of Jenny Aubry, the mother of Elisabeth Roudinesco, who was in supervision with Lacan for 2 years between January 52 and January 54, also 3 sessions a week. So again, you can ask me about all of this in the discussion, but there's some interesting things that you can derive from that information, not only to do with the frequency of the sessions, but also to do with the relation between analysis and supervision, for example. But I'm only showing this in order to argue that Lacan's position or Lacan's place was not just that of a teacher, but you already knew that, of course, right? It was balanced against his position of an analyst and a supervisor. Now, all of this changed radically, dramatically, and tragically in 1963. All of this changed as a result of deep-seated, deep-rooted conflicts, both within the psychoanalytic institution to which Lacan belonged and between that institution and the IPA. And what I'm showing you is the transcript of the last meeting that was organized between representatives of the IPA and the executive of the SFP, which took place in June 1963, as you can see there, at the Hotel Westminster in Paris. I have no idea what this blue thing is doing there, but it's gone. Okay, it's gone. But if you look at these minutes, and again, until recently, no one had ever found these minutes, so I will talk extensively about them in my biography. But if you look at these minutes, then the most interesting thing to note is that for almost the entire weekend, Lacan doesn't say anything. And when he speaks, I've highlighted it here in red, when he speaks, he talks in order to say why he doesn't talk, right? So the first sentence there of the paragraph, I'm not going to read it in its entirety. The first sentence there is basically Lacan's explanation as to why he hasn't opened his mouth. And it basically comes down to the fact that he hasn't opened his mouth because he thinks that everyone else who is there, including his own, to some extent at least, his own colleagues are complete idiots. And he says, I don't want to waste my words talking to people who don't have the requisite basic knowledge to even hear what I have to say to them. But to cut a long, complicated story short, all of this changed in 1963. And again, some of you will know this, because in 1963 at the IPA conference, the Turcotte report, which came out of the meeting that I just showed you, was accepted, led to the Stockholm Directive, and eventually led to what Lacan called his excommunication. Now, many people think that the excommunication meant that Lacan was totally, completely rejected, or that it meant that he could not occupy any position whatsoever anymore within the space of his own organization. Not true. So what the IPA demanded as a condition for their reaffiliation was that Lacan could no longer be a training analyst, right? So they didn't care all that much about Lacan being an analyst. It's just that they did not want him to be a training analyst anymore. But being a training analyst also meant occupying a position of teaching, right? So it was a big deal. So when the SFP accepted the Stockholm Directive, I think Lacan felt himself cornered to the point where he did no longer have any other option than to resign, because for him it would have been unthinkable no longer be able to teach and no longer to be able to train new analysts. But as a result of this, the place of Lacan's teaching changed dramatically from January 1964 in 4 fundamental respects. And what I will do for the remainder of the time, and I think I can do this in about 15 minutes, is to illustrate how these 4 fundamental changes led to a reconsideration of the transmission of psychoanalysis, but not to actually to answers to the questions that were already there in the 1950s. So Lacan's position changed, but in a sense, as a result of these changes, the paradoxes, the quandaries became even more apparent, and led to new questions rather than the formulation of answers. And some of these questions, I think, are as relevant today as they were back in the mid-1960s. So the first fundamental change is that Lacan, and I'm not going to go into any detail, is that Lacan, by the way, we can date each of these changes, we can put an exact date on them, right? So the first fundamental change is that on the 15th of January 1964, Lacan started teaching again. But at that point, he was no longer a member of any psychoanalytic institution, including his own, right? So at that point, and this was actually the only time in Lacan's career, Lacan was effectively an academic, because he taught in the capacity of a lecturer at the École pratique des hautes études. And that's why for the seminars during the 1960s, you also find these summaries that are sometimes printed at the back of the seminar, sometimes. So Lacan taught as an academic. His teaching position was no longer balanced against that of others. So as I said earlier on, during the 50s, it was balanced against that of Lagache and that of Favès-Boutonnier, although the others were considered inferior. But here, he was the one, in a mathematical sense, the only one. Okay. It was academic, the audience changed, it expanded, but it also changed from people who were training to a large number of people who were studying, either at the École Normale Supérieure or at the École Pratique des Hautes Études. And as I said, it was outside psychoanalytic institutions. So the first change is that Lacan started teaching as the one in a non-clinical educational space, as an academic. Secondly, by the way, I call this epistemic transmission. And I think you see this in the seminars, at least in the early seminars from 1964 onwards, more than in the seminars of the 1950s. What is going on is the transmission of knowledge more than anything else. Now, the second fundamental change, again, we can date. And we can date it exactly to Solstice Day, June 1964, when Lacan established his own school, the École Freudienne de Paris, notably on the basis of a founding act that was not only distributed subsequently to everyone who wanted to be a member, but that was actually also read. Again, not many people know this, but the foundation of the École Freudienne de Paris almost was a surrealist performance. It took place in the Salon because François Perrier, in his apartment on the Avenue de l'Observatoire, and you see the image there to the left, had a large salon, and in the large table in the middle of the salon, there was one of those big tape recorders, and about 50 people had received invitations to come to an event without knowing what the event was about. And at one point, François Perrier pressed the button of the tape recorder, and Lacan's voice could be heard, but Lacan was not there in person. And Lacan's voice could be heard saying, "Je fonds," I hereby found, you see. And in the middle of the disembodied voice, he then walked into the room, and the rest is history. But what you see here is not an epistemic transmission. It's what I would call an institutional transmission. An institutional transmission because the transmission doesn't just emanate from a position of knowledge that is occupied by one person. It becomes a transmission that flows and that is redistributed alongside the stratification of the institution. Now, interestingly, just prior to the foundation of the École Freudienne de Paris, and this is actually very interesting, someone called Jean Clavreul, for the first time in history, asked the question, what does it mean to be a Lacanian? You know, no one asked this question during the 1950s for a very good reason. They didn't ask the question because the Société Française de Psychanalyse wasn't just Lacan school, you know. Everyone knew they were training as analysts, but they would not consider themselves to be Lacanians, but analysts of the Société Française de Psychanalyse. What you have here is the foundation of a school that is not only the result of Lacan's own initiative, but that is also under the directorship of Lacan. And I mean, so Jean Clavreul asks the question for the first time in history, and his answer to his own question is as instructive as anything else that Clavreul subsequently would write, because I think he was one of the most interesting people working in the École Freudienne de Paris. So Jean Clavreul answer to the question, to his own question, was not. He said, what does it mean to be a Lacanian? He said, well, it doesn't mean that you have had to be in analysis with Lacan, 1. 2, it doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything that Lacan says. And he goes on giving, I'm not going to give you all of them, a series of other negative definitions, as a result of which you can already draw the conclusion that it's easier to answer the question in a negative way than in a positive way. But in the end, when he does attempt a positive definition, he says, well, what it means is that collaboratively we question knowledge as a function within the transmission of psychoanalysis as a clinical practice. So what he considered to be Lacanian, and what he, Jean Clavreul, considered to be unique, whether it's unique, we can talk about that, but what he considered to be unique is the fact that Lacanian meant to question knowledge as a function within the transmission of psychoanalysis as a clinical practice. The third major event is the publication of Écrit, which, as I said at the very beginning of my talk, was published on the 15th of November 1966, and which should not be underestimated. The publication of Écrit for Lacan made a huge difference, not only because he started receiving numerous invitations, including from abroad, but also because it actually prompted Lacan to think, perhaps for the first time, seriously, about the function of writing. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that the huge paradox about this book, which is called Writings, is that it actually doesn't contain a solid theory of writing. I mean, I don't think it does, but at least Lacan intermittently makes an attempt to consider what writing can contribute, again, to the transmission of psychoanalysis. And his answer is interesting because his answer is perhaps captured most poignantly in a paper called Kant with Sade, where Lacan identifies Sade's writings as operating from the position of the object A. That is to say, from the position of the non-object, you know. By the way, you can't see this anymore in the English translation of écrit because that connection was accidentally deleted. Again, we can talk about that in the discussion if you want. But in a sense, and that would have been fantastic, right? But I don't think any publisher would have accepted it. In a sense, this book, this 900-page volume, could have been published like that. Now, wouldn't you want to see a 900-page book with the title A? I mean, that would have been fantastic, no? I mean, come on. But I don't think, as I said, any publisher would have accepted it. But isn't this the kind of book that would immediately attract your attention, right? Now, here, the question was not, what does it mean to be a Lacanian? So as I said earlier on, the result of Lacan's foundation of his own school was that people started asking themselves questions, what does it mean to be Lacanian? The result of the publication of this book was, in a sense, much more simple. The result is, what does it mean? You know, I'm not going to go into autobiographical digressions here, but I think everyone has had the experience of delving into the écrit and asking oneself consciously or unconsciously the question, what the fuck does it mean? I deliberately deleted the fuck there, but I think it is fully deserving of being included in that question. Now, Jean-Claude Milner has called this the exoteric part of Lacan's teaching. Exoteric because the book, paradoxically, was, of course, not restricted. It was not something that circulated to a small group. It was something that could be bought, and it was a major bestseller for reasons that no one really knows. But it was a book that was available to everyone. That is to say, it was a book that technically the general public had access to. But it was also, there you go, it was also a book, and it still is, I think, a book that compels you to square accounts with your own desire, you know? If you indeed go through the trouble, through the pain, through the agony of reading écrit from cover to cover, and you constantly ask yourself the question, what the fuck does this mean? In the end, you're going to ask yourself the question, well, why the fuck am I doing this in the first place? You know, because you don't read these 900 pages in the space of a month, let alone in the space of a week. So this is a book that you need to work through. And working through is nothing more, nothing less than squaring accounts, and this is Lacan's own phrase, with your desire. Now, the fourth and final, and perhaps most controversial, I need another 5 minutes or so, the fourth and final change that occurred between 1963 and 1967 is Lacan's proposition of 9 October 1967. So again, we can date it exactly because that's when he launched it, and this is the proposition of the past, which is included not in écrit, but is included in Autres écrits, but is also available in English. It was published, it was translated by Russell Grigg and included in the Australian journal Analysis, but you can find it online without difficulty. It actually comes in different versions, but that's another story. But this proposition of the past, I mean, forget the variable length sessions, forget the short sessions. I would say this is probably the most controversial invention that Lacan came up with throughout his career as a psychoanalyst. But the proposition already starts with, I've underlined it there in black, already starts with the polemical or the provocative proposition, le psychanalyste ne s'autorise que de lui-même, right? Literally means a psychoanalyst only authorizes him or herself by virtue of him or herself, which many people interpreted as anyone can call themselves a psychoanalyst. That's, of course, not what Lacan meant, but that's how it was interpreted. But the reason why it was so controversial is that Lacan tried and failed. And he admitted so. He tried and failed to create an institution of psychoanalysts that was not hierarchical, that was egalitarian, in which people, again, would occupy various positions as analysts, none of which were more inferior or superior than others. At least that was his idea. And so he distinguished between les analystes praticiens, les AP, les analystes membres de l'école, the analyst members of the school, and les analystes de l'école, the AE, right? Now, this question here is not, the question underpinning the proposition of the past was not, what does it mean? I mean, there was no discussion at all, insofar as I've been able to establish, as to what Lacan meant here. You know, you can ask that question for the A-Pre, but not with the proposition of the past. Everyone knew what he meant. But the question that it elicited was, what do I want? Why? Well, because the difference between the AME and the AE, the difference between the analyst member of the school and the analyst of the school was a difference of desire. So in order to become an analyst of the school, you had to express a desire to become an analyst. Whereas the analyst members of the school were just people who were appointed, sometimes unexpectedly, surprisingly, appointed as a result of presentations and papers they had given at conferences by a small group of people called le jury d'agrément. And I'm not going to go into any detail here, but so the difference between the two positions is that the AE rests on an explicitly formulated desire of this particular analysand here wanting to be or become an analyst. Now, as I said, Lacan tried, but this is the analytic transmission, I would say. So I'll bring them together in my final slide in a minute. So this is the analytic transmission, which again compels you to square accounts with your desire, right? So many members of the École Freudienne de Paris left the school in 1967 because they thought this proposition of the past was a bad idea. Many of them stayed, but were then actually faced with their own question: do I want to apply to go through the path, or do I want to wait until I'm being appointed an analyst member of the school, or do I want to be an AP? By the way, Jacques Lacan earlier this year, in a conversation that I think you can watch online, and he would have known, he said before long, new hierarchies, and that's the first problem, new hierarchies started to establish themselves. As a result of which, the practicing analysts, the first category, were often considered to be the fake analysts, the non-analysts, because most of these people hadn't finished their analysis yet, or at least the end of their analysis hadn't been formally been ratified. But there were other problems. The other problem was, of course, Lacan's own position within the school, you know. So here is Lacan trying to create an institution that is based on egalitarian principles rather than hierarchical principles. But what is he going to do with himself? You know, you can't extract yourself from the equation. Now you can say you need an exception in order to create the universal. That's what Hegel would have argued, but that didn't solve the issue that the exception was still there and that the exception was actually very active right? Rather than being excluded. But it also raised the question, and what is highlighted in blue here are what Miller calls the paradoxes of the past, or the paradoxes of the AE. It also raises the question as to how a psychoanalytic training organization actually ratifies, acknowledges that someone who is asked to be an analyst deserves to be called an analyst, right? I mean, there's actually a deeper paradox running through the AEs, which Miller also mentioned earlier this year. The deeper paradox running through the AE is that technically an analyst of the school could have been recognized as having finished their analysis without them ever having seen any patients, you see. So it was not necessary for an analyst of the school to have had any kind of clinical experience from the position of the analyst. And then finally, and most importantly, what traces, someone called Louis Iskovich calls these marks, but the question is also raised, what traces should one's own analysis have left in order to be authorized, or in order to authorize oneself to practice? More questions than answers, as I said, as a result of which I need 1 minute, 2 minutes, more questions than answers, as a result of which Lacan himself eventually came to the conclusion that the proposition of the past was actually a failure. But as we all know, many psychoanalytic institutions, not just Lacanians, I know of at least one institution here in London that is not Lacanian at all, continue to use it in one form or another in order to ratify, acknowledge the end of analysis. So there you go. This is what we're left with. And what we're left with is the need, and I do think it's a need rather than a demand or a desire, the need to ensure that psychoanalysis as a clinical practice is being transmitted. Because if you don't accept this as a need, then inevitably psychoanalysis is not going to survive, right? So every organization, whether it calls itself a training organization or not, at some point is faced with the question of what in management speak they call succession management. Like, how are you going to ensure that within the organization new analysts are acknowledged and start to practice? I've given you four distinct forms of transmission that emerge from the changes in Lacan's teaching between 1963 and 1967. There's epistemic transmission, which takes place in the lecture theatre, right? There is exoteric transmission, which takes place as a result of you reading the écrit and asking yourself the question, what the fuck does it mean, and what the fuck am I doing here reading this bloody book? There is analytic transmission, which results from the position of the past. And by the way, I'm not mentioning them chronologically or hierarchically. I think each of them contributes in this, not in the same way, but contributes equally to the training of analysts. So there is the analytic transmission, which stems from the expression of a desire to move from the position of the analysand to the position of the analyst. And finally, there is the institutional transmission, which stems in this case from the foundation of a school or the constitution of an organization. Now, this is not all. Lacan's answer, and I think some of these answers are worth exploring, and we may want to do that in the discussion. Lacan's answer went beyond this. So this is my systematization, in a sense, of Lacan's answer that he tried to develop within the space of 10, 15 years. It went beyond this because he also reflected on the process. And when he reflected on the process, he basically argued that for those four types of transmission, what needs to happen is exactly the opposite as the conventional process, okay? So I'm now going to project the conventional process. So the conventional process of epistemic transmission is that you acquire doctrinal knowledge, okay? Much like the student would do who passively absorbs and assimilates the knowledge that is being professed by the teacher who is a professor of whatever, yeah? So that's the conventional. Secondly, with regard to reading the écrit, the conventional process would be the extraction of some kind of fixed meaning from that book. With regard to analytic transmission, the conventional, and I think it still happens, the conventional transmission is the restitution of the ego. Right? I mean, the Lacan of 1953 already thought that it was bonkers, but it doesn't stop from infiltrating the process. And finally, the conventional transmission of an institutional process is that of an identification. You identify with your position within the school, or indeed you identify with the school. What Lacan opposed there, and that's what I'm going to leave you with, what Lacan opposed to each of these four conventional processes of transmission are four radically different things. There you go. So rather than doctrinal knowledge, he advocated knowledge in a position of failure. That is to say, knowledge that is always questioned, much like Clavreul said, that is always questioned in terms of the function that it occupies with regard to the transmission of clinical practice. So knowledge is never finished. It can never be fully said. Secondly, with regard to écrit, he advocated not that the book was going to become the Bible, but that in a sense, the book is used in order to invent and reinvent, not meaning, but sense in its relation to nonsense. Finally, and this is, no, not finally, I'm almost there. Finally, with regard to the past, in the proposition of 9 October 1967, he literally stated that the end of analysis can only coincide with subjective destitution, which is, of course, exactly the opposite as the restitution of the ego. Subjective destitution actually means that the end of analysis coincides not with a gain, but with a loss. That the product of the analytic discourse is that something disappears rather than something that you acquire. And then finally, with regard to the organization of the school, in opposition to identification, what he proposed was dynamic permutation. But as far as that's concerned, as some of you will know, he generally didn't go far enough, I think, because it only applied to the cartels and not so much to the school as a whole. So there you go. I've gone 5 minutes over time, for which I apologize, but I hope I've given you something to think about. And I also think that what I've projected here on the last slide is as relevant today as it was 60 years ago in terms of how we ensure that that psychoanalysis as a clinical practice is indeed being transmitted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dany. This was most fascinating, brilliant. Thank you. If you could stop sharing your screen, we can take maybe questions, or if you want us to leave with this.
No, I can stop sharing my screen, and you can relieve me of my hosting position, which I do feel is weighing down on me. So
yes.
Make me passive, Sanam. Pacify and pacify me. There you go.
I will cause destitution in you. I will relieve you if you're a host. Exactly. Yes.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you. Hilda, could you make me a host, please? So, are there any questions? I mean, I think, Dany, this is absolutely most brilliant and fascinating, and especially the last two slides that I haven't seen before was definitely touching on the not all, because I think it is the not all, right? I mean, it is everything that we know about the conventional process is being not necessarily reversed, but like taken inside out. And as the analyst discourse is what it's about. But I'm going to ask if people have any questions, any comments,
criticisms.
criticisms.
Please don't take this as doctrinal knowledge. This is, as I said, the result of me working on the biography, but also the result of me thinking through the relevance of some of Lacan's questions during the 1960s for contemporary psychoanalytic practice and the institutional transmission of psychoanalysis.
Hilda?
Dany, thank you so much for this amazing talk that really talks about something very pressing for anyone that is trying to create a spaces of analysis anywhere. I wanted to ask you kind of well, first of all, like the reflection of a little bit of the impossible sort of nature of the transmission of psychoanalysis, and how what you presented in the last slide kind of shows exactly the tensions between what naturally in group mentality, in light of narcissism, tends to polarize towards like the ego and all those things that you said, identifications, that it's sort of akin to any sort of a group, no? But how these other categories that Lacan is proposing is precisely to aspire to the impossible as a horizon. But I wanted to ask you about these space and places are kind of words that are very geographical, right? Like it has to do with the places, physical, but also the places that people embody or occupy with others collectively. So it's Lacan as the figure that created all these amazing sort of apparatus that we're still grappling around, but at the same time in dialogue with the people that was listening to him. So my question is there in these kind of four types of transmission, the epistemic, the institutional, the exoteric, and the analytic, do you think that this is sort of a way of like a form of evolution? It's a form of natural evolution within groups or organizations. Is this sort of a necessary, journey that groups sort of have to grapple? My feeling is that there's a need of certain maturity, not only by whoever is leading, but also by the constituency that support transmission of this type. No? So that's my question. Yeah. Thank you, Dany, very much.
Thank you, Hilda. I mean, it's a great question. And whenever I say that, it means that I'm probably not going to be able to answer it. So I'll do my best. But I can only speak with my voice, and you don't want anyone else to speak through me. So what I will say is my own personal opinion. To answer your question, from my own perspective, I do not think that these four modalities, let's for the sake of the discussion called the modalities, these four modalities of transmission, I don't think that they are necessary. I don't think so. You may disagree, and I'd love to hear your arguments. I don't think they are necessary. For example, I don't think it is necessary for psychoanalysis as a clinical practice to be transmitted on the basis of a certain institutional structure. So I do not think that the institutional structure is a necessary precondition for the transmission of clinical practice. And the reason why I'm saying that is that the last 110 years or so, I'm trying to think when the IPA was established, 1910, you know, the last 110 years or so have shown time and again that institutions, psychoanalytic institutions, if anything, are rarely purely generative, and are almost always pervaded by internal conflict, and I'm saying this lightly, internal conflict that actually harms rather than facilitates the transmission of psychoanalysis. Elisabeth Roudinesco said somewhere a couple of years ago, you know, if psychoanalysis is if it is going to die, it's the psychoanalysts themselves who are going to be responsible for it, on account of the fact that their institutions or the institutional practices are so vociferous. Vociferous means in this case characterized by fractures. Yeah, they seem to be inherently fractured rather than generative. Okay. Now, I don't want to take too much time because there are other questions as well. That leaves us, of course, with the question as to what extent the other forms of transmission are necessary. And there I'm tempted to say that the other, so the epistemic transmission, the exoteric transmission, and the analytic transmission, I mean, I do think that those are necessary, but I'm not convinced they are sufficient. You see, so I do think that as part of a psychoanalytic training program, knowledge needs to be transmitted, but that it can only be transmitted properly on condition that the knowledge that is being transmitted is simultaneously questioned, right? Ditto with reading the psychoanalytic literature. I think the psychoanalytic literature, and you know, I could have put Freud's interpretation of dreams there instead of the écrit. I think the psychoanalytic literature is a crucial, necessary part of the transmission of psychoanalysis as a clinical practice, on condition that that literature does not become petrified into some kind of doctrinal meaning, but is maintained as an open-ended literature that is open to discussion, which is effectively what we do in cartels or in reading groups. Okay. Now, so I think the three others are necessary but not sufficient, which of course then raises the question: what do you want to add to it? You know, what do you want to add to it? Well, my answer to that is that what I want to add to it is not a fourth component, but a better integrated relation between a better integrated dynamic relation between the three other components, because the three other components are often regarded as isolated components that do not influence one another. And I think what we need to think about is to really bring, analytic transmission into the classroom. But what we need to think about is also how we can bring analytic transmission into the exoteric. I hope you understand what I mean. So what I'm actually arguing for is that the +1 here does not sit in us thinking about adding something new. If that something new is a fourth component, what I'm arguing for is a more profound, in-depth consideration of the relations between the three other components, to the point where you could even look at them as a Borromean knot, which, as we all know, there are overlaps, there are interactions. It's a dynamic, changing structure, rather than three orders that operate in isolation from one another. So that would be my answer.
Thank you so much, Dany. Lots of things.
Thank you. So you're talking about an epistemic destitution in a way. Literally, and the +1 cutting and subtracting. But
absolutely, yeah.
I'm not going to take up space.
Or
Geraldine,
at least, and I'm talking about the possibility of the destitution of knowledge.
Exactly.
I'm talking about the destitution of knowledge being on the agenda, on the side of the epistemic transmission. Yeah.
Yes. Geraldine, and then Juan Luis.
Hello from Ireland, and it's wonderful to be part of this stunning presentation. Thank you very much, Dany. I'm preparing a paper myself for a congress here in Dublin in 2 weeks, so it's very exciting listening to all of you engage in these critical pieces of work. And I have rarely seen anything as put so well in terms of even like the subjective destitution and loss, having finished one's analysis. And I started analysis in Paris in the 80s, and I'm still learning. But one of the things I think it's really worth reflecting on, because it's become an issue here in Ireland, is that the state has put together a statutory registration board to actually define how one becomes a psychotherapist of any background or modality. And it is causing absolute consternation for those of us who are psychoanalysts, because it ignores personal analysis as a requisite, and it absolutely rejects the necessity for supervision, which is my paper. But I always describe that as two beings engaging in the unknown on behalf of the analysand or the patient. It's exploratory as opposed to judgmental. So I think being faced with statutory intervention from a panel of government appointed people who have legal powers, but who are ignorant. Your paper would leave them looking for analysis of the galaxy. They wouldn't have a clue, and that's quite disturbing, and I think it needs to be raised.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's a very valid and astute observation, which, by the way, doesn't only affect psychoanalytic communities in Ireland, but, as you know, Francine will know this, has affected psychoanalytic communities in Belgium and other parts of Europe. The only thing I can say in response, by the way, I'm happy to share my slides with anyone who wants the slides. What I sent to Sanem, as I said at the beginning, was the not all, of course. But at the end, I will send the full set of slides, and I can send them to Hilda as well. And so if you want them, you can. I suggest that you either email Sanem or Hilda, or you can email me directly, and I would be happy to share my slides. but I don't have a paper. So what I presented today was improvised. Okay. So what I can't do is share with you a text because I don't have a text. Now, I will respond to your question. I think the only response to that can be for clinicians, and I'm reluctant to say psychoanalysts because that might exclude those who have gone through psychoanalytic psychotherapy or psychodynamic. I mean, I'm not in favor of exclusion when these things are at stake. I'm in favor. And I think actually some people in Paris, for all the differences between the 40-odd Lacanian groups, would probably agree with me that when these things are at stake, you have to come together. You have to be prepared to set aside your differences, and you have to come together and propose an alternative. That's the only way. Because if you don't set aside your differences, then they will actually use that against you, the state that is. They will use it against you, and you just run the risk of losing out, which is not the same as losing. Losing out, that's the bad way of losing. So I think the response has to be a coherent, consistent response from everyone who believes that this type of state regulation is not only formalistic, but actually misguided, and as you pointed out yourself, based on ignorance. But that's the only thing I can say. Now, I'm going to talk in Berlin in a couple of weeks' time about these issues as well, because in Germany the situation is even more complicated. But many countries struggle with these questions, and I think, as I said, a coherent, consistent alternative needs to be formulated. You can start with the Eitingon model, although the Eitingon model has its own drawbacks. The Eitingon model was invented by Max Eitingon in the Berlin Psychoanalytic Society, early 1920s, and says, psychoanalytic training is based on 3 pillars. Theoretical instruction, 1, your own analysis, 2, and 3, supervision. Right? Now, okay, I'm not going to go into any depth as to the drawbacks, but you might as well start from the Eitingon model. But you have to present an alternative and make your voice heard. But thank you for your question, Geraldine.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Juan Luis.
Yes, well, again, thank you, Dany, for a wonderful talk. So much to think about. And I would like to just comment one thing and ask you a question. So the comment is regarding the minutes that you were kind enough to share. I don't think I would agree with you when you say that Lacan considers even his own companions to be not worthy of his words. I believe there he only refers to what he considers at that very moment his enemies. But I mean, it's only I think that to think, and I agree with you that what you presented today is of enormous relevance for anyone who is interested in what is called psychoanalytic training or formation, and you were, I think, very on point when you say that this is a question of if psychoanalysis will survive, right? To train the next generation of psychoanalysts and so on. But then that is a goal that we set for ourselves, right? You said, for example, what to add to these 4 forms, modalities of transmission. And of course, there would also be the option to not to add anything, to make it possible to sustain a transmission and an institutional life, a praxis, where something is always missing.
Yeah.
And that would bring about, and I would like for you to comment a little more on the concept of failure, because I really like how you propose knowledge in failure against obtaining a doctrinal knowledge, right? The traditional epistemic transmission. But then if we set for ourselves a goal, that is the survival of psychoanalysis, the training of the new generation, and so on, we must think not only of its survival, but how, what kind of praxis will result of certain kinds of institutional lives and certain kinds of transmission. Of course, as Geraldine very well reminds us, we must engage with power. We must engage with the state. Otherwise, we leave all the space there for psychoanalysis to be eradicated under the power of regulations and all these sort of problems that European countries, but also in North America, we face, right? So the praxis, it has political engagements in every form and or modality that we can invent, the pass, the 18 on tripod, seminars, cartels. There is a formation and a circulation of power. And so I would like to for you to comment on the idea of failure and success. If we set for ourselves a goal, the transmission, we are thinking we must be successful. How do we manage to successfully train the new generation? But at the same time, paradoxically, we are looking to precisely create a model that fails, that always fails to create power and to crystallize it in the imaginary figure of a master or a teacher, which is the same word, right, in French, and so on. So we need to succeed, but we need to fail. And how do we manage that?
Yeah. No, thank you, Juan Luis. I mean, again, it's a very good question, which means that I'm not sure I have the answer. But in a sense, that's the whole point, isn't it? That we're not here just to answer questions. We're here to question answers. I think it's more important. Okay, 3 points. I mean, first of all, the expression knowledge and failure is my own English translation of a phrase that Lacan uses in Littérature, where in French it is savoir en échec. Savoir en échec. I have a feeling that Bruce Fink, who is currently translating Seminar 18, which will come out in English next year, I have a feeling, because Bruce and I have been talking about this, that his translation might be slightly different. But there you go. So knowledge and failure is my translation of savoir en échec. What I mean by that is that and bear in mind here, we're talking about the epistemic side of transmission, right? So we're talking, and still my first point, we're talking about how psychoanalysis is transmitted as a body of knowledge. So what I've tried to argue for is that the transmission of psychoanalysis as a body of knowledge can only contribute properly to the transmission of psychoanalysis as a clinical practice if that knowledge is put into question. Which, by the way, is very much what Lacan was doing during the 1950s, I would say. Perhaps less so later on, but very much during the 1960s. During the 1950s. So maybe you and I will agree when I say, yes, he claimed that the only thing he was doing was returning to Freud, but before long you come to the conclusion that his interpretation of Freud is actually a questioning. It's a questioning of Freud.
Absolutely.
So that's what I mean. So knowledge and failure is is adopting the position of a teacher, whereby the knowledge is not only given, relayed as something that is firmly established, but where it is also questioned, preferably collaboratively rather than ex cathedra. Now, with regard I said I was going to make 3 points. So that was the first point. The second point is that when we talk about the transmission of psychoanalysis, we can talk about theory, we can talk about method, and we can talk about practice. Maybe I didn't make it sufficiently clear today, but what I had in mind today was the transmission of psychoanalysis as a practice. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind that as a theory and as a method, it will probably survive without these transmissions, or that these transmissions are not absolutely necessary for the theory of psychoanalysis to live on. I feel I can say that because there are enough people out there, we know who they are, such as Slavoj Žižek, who isn't an academic, who isn't I mean, God forbid, can you imagine, who isn't a practicing Lacanian analyst, but who contributes, right? Let's face it, who contributes to the survival of psychoanalysis as a knowledge, as a theory. So the second point I want to make is that the actual question is how do you ensure that it is transmitted as a clinical practice? And that means, you said it yourself, that you need to have a concept of what the clinical practice of psychoanalysis entails, right? Because if you don't know what it entails, then you will not know whether you've transmitted it. And I think that's what prompted Lacan in 1969, 1970 to actually come up with the theory of the four discourses. I mean, for me, but also in seminar 18, by the way, for me, those two seminars are actually seminars on what is the clinical practice of psychoanalysis all about. And he offers a formalization and says, well, it's all, I don't need to tell you, you know this, it's all about someone, we call him or her psychoanalysis, adopting the position of the semblance of object A. Now that sounds terribly abstract, but at least Lacan had a concept, an idea of clinical practice. Now, once you have that, then you need to think about how you're going to transmit it. And as I said, the key factor there that is often forgotten, and that's the third point, the key factor that's often forgotten is that this transmission, I think, which I hear called the analytic transmission, is not about gains and profits and acquisitions. It's exactly the opposite. So whenever someone comes to you and asks you, as happens to me every so often, what did you get out of your analysis? I always say, it's the wrong question. The question, what did you gain from your analysis? It's the wrong question. The question is, what did you lose as a result of your analysis? So you need to ensure that the clinical transmission is all about reserving a place for the acknowledgement of loss as a product. Now, I'm not going to develop that further because I think there are other questions, but that of course again means that you need to have a concept of what kind of loss you're looking for. And you know, thought in my head, well, we can probably, you and I already think of at least 3 or 4 kinds of losses that we would be looking for. And those 3 or 4 losses would probably have to do with narcissism, the ego, with power, as in clinical practice will not be transmitted if what we transmit is a position of power. You know, it has to be disempowerment, rather than power. So all these things, you and I will probably agree, but we need to actually, I think, formalize them, not necessarily put them on paper, but formalize them as part of the training program. And I don't think that Lacan succeeded in that when he introduced the pass. And I think when he admitted that the pass was a failure, it's probably because he himself had come to the conclusion that this transmission of loss had actually been turned once again into its opposite. But yeah, so that's all I can say in response to your question. But again, it probably raises more questions than answers. But at least I think we need to think about it. We any psychoanalytic institution, if we have an institution that provides the structure for the training, needs to think about it. Otherwise, you run the risk, and again, that's different, of losing out, or churning out clinicians,
yes,
who are not psychoanalysts, but clinicians who are driven by something else than the desire of the analyst.
Thank you.
And
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Luis.
Thank you. And I do want to jump in because this is such an interesting conversation. It's a paradox. What did you lose in analysis? Because we're dealing with the transmission of something ineffable that can be only formulated in language, and a language that is not about the past, but that directs itself to the future.
Correct. Yeah.
So there's the futurality of the loss,
yes,
which is paradoxical, which is incredibly hard to grasp, and it's futurality because it can only be articulated at the time of the speech. Right? It cannot be articulated, and that was, I think, this is also partially the point that Jacques Lacan made in the talk that you referred to a couple of times. All the passes at the moment are written passes, which means that you're taking the position of the clinician, you're taking the position of the master upon yourself to diagnose your own case. They're not spoken. If the pass was something that is spoken, then it is a here and there articulation, and an articulation towards what we like, towards this, I don't know, maybe the future to come, not a future, not a linear future, but speaking, opening up these points and opening up these notions of articulating the loss, which is something that's inarticulable, if there's any word as such. So the epistemic destitution, so the paradoxes and the open-endedness, and I think these like four, and I'm going to call them pillars, because I think the four pillars are fascinating. They constantly need to be, as you're saying, elaborated, articulated, and constantly, like, these positions need to be cut such that we would have subtracted all the time, such that there's the dynamism of it. So that's the one thing that actually the notion of the future and the future orientedness of psychoanalysis, and how to conceptualize that future. And I think that this is also partially in Lacan's case, because you have said that he never ever actually looked back. And I think there's something there.
He hated it. He hated it.
Absolutely. He hated it. And why did he hate it? Because there's nothing to be gained from it.
No.
Right? There's nothing, and exactly about, like, if we go to past and if we say, like, this is what we were, this is what I was in the past, and this is what I am now in the future, like, it's the ego psychology, right? The first, in 1953, you said that it's the losing of the ego, or the disappearance of the ego. Yeah. So that's one thing. The question, though, I want to ask is the continuity between, continuity of 1964, because with excommunication, in whichever way we want to conceptualize it, something has changed. There's a non-existent seminar there. that he gave only one. So he lost the seminar, and there was only the beginning. So how can we sustain a continuity with such a radical rupture in between? The more I read, because we're studying at the moment the seminar 11 or 1964 seminar, and it seems to be very different.
Well,
so that's my question to you.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right that a proper consideration of transmission also needs to include a reflection upon the dimension of time. For reasons of time, I didn't include time in my presentation today. So I merely talked about places, spaces, and traces, but time is as crucial. And I showed you those two examples of the frequency with which people were in analysis or in supervision. But what I do want to say is that when it came to time, Lacan, unlike Freud, was also not a historical determinist. You know, I mean, yes, there is a return to Freud in the 1950s, but already from the Rome discourse, where I think he introduces this whole concept of le futur antérieur, the future perfect. What lies behind it is that our mental economy is not conditioned by our life history, which opens up a dimension of freedom, or a dimension of the real, you could say, but also a point in time whereby the fleeting present is constantly taken up in a movement towards the future, which I think is more liberating as a concept of analysis than Freud's take on analysis. But with regard to your second point, which I've kind of forgotten now, so probably deliberately focused on time. With regard to those four pillars, can you just remind me of, in one sentence, the gist of your second question, Sanem? Is it
the second question was
about writing?
No, it's not about writing. It was about the continuity of the teaching, as almost like a single teaching with a very major break in between.
I mean, look, if he had wanted to, Lacan could have restarted in January 1964 with the Seminar on the Names of the Father, I think. The fact that he didn't restart that seminar or continue that seminar is an act in the Lacanian sense of it is Lacan himself crossing the Rubicon, so to speak, in order to start afresh, anew, with a new beginning. In a new place, in a new space. But also, I agree with you that from Seminar 11, the way he relates to knowledge actually changes, I think, quite dramatically, in a sense that what he's doing as a teacher at the École Normale Supérieure is offering or questioning or developing, perhaps for the first time in history, what could be properly called Lacanian theory. You know, I mean, during the 1950s, even if it's not announced as séminaire de texte, he is working much more with Freudian concepts still. transference, of identification, of formation of the unconscious, etc. 1964. I mean, even the titles of the seminars, they sound very Heideggerian, but 1964, it is his own theory that is at stake, I would say. It doesn't mean that he's less or more creative. It means that his frame of reference has changed. And I think that is a deliberate move. I don't think that that's by accident, you know.
Yes, and it starts with the loss. So
And
it starts with, as you are saying, it starts with the loss. He could have continued with the names of the father. He loses it. It's exactly the act is based upon the loss. Yes.
So the act is based on the seminar that doesn't exist, basically.
Exactly.
I mean, by the way, Jacques Lacan wrote a very interesting. It may only be available in Spanish, actually. Delivered a very seminar 20 years ago in Argentina. It's called the Seminar on the Non-Existent Seminar. You know, but so you're right. So the act is based on a loss. There you go. Yeah,
exactly. Thank you, Dany. Hilda, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm aware that we have 3 minutes, but I just wanted to address what people were saying in the chat. They were asking, which Dany actually addressed the future perfect on your questions and them about the time, and and also I just wanted to bring again this tension, this paradox between knowledge, right? Like to be able to destitute or exercise epistemic destitution, you have to first sort of have some sort of epistemic to loss, right? Like you first sort of needs some understandings of the theory to be able to deconstruct it or to lose it in a way. No, just I wanted to say it's paradoxical, right? Because we know in the clinic the knowledge, theoretical knowledge, is actually of not very kind of help in the moment. You are not thinking about, right? You are not thinking about anything, but just like going with the intervention as it presents, right? Yeah.
Well, you would hope so. You would hope so. I mean, I would hope so. It doesn't always happen, and I'm not going to give any examples because I can't control who's in the room, and so I don't want to give any concrete clinical examples. That's the disadvantage of Zoom, of course. But I do hear in supervision that it does happen. Now, we're all human, right? I mean, what I'm trying to say is that it does happen that analysts use theory or use knowledge as a tool to put patients and what happens in analysis into boxes. It does happen. It's not supposed to happen. I mean, even Freud already said, that as an analyst, you always need to put yourself in a position where you can learn something from your patient, as opposed to in a position where you teach something to your patient. You need to learn something from your patient. So that can only mean that you actually admit that there are certain things that you don't know. And at the risk of ending on another paradox by relying on an authority argument, yes, Lacan said that the analyst's knowledge is a symptom of the analyst's ignorance, but that is not an excuse for an analyst to not know anything. It's just that you need to know how to use your own knowledge in such a way that you learn, rather than using it in such a way that you know, in a sense. So as a result of which, and again, maybe Lacan could have said more about this during the 70s, but he didn't. But as a result of which, I actually agree with Masoud Khan, and Sanem knows that in a totally other project. I've done a lot of reading and on Masoud Khan, but one of Masoud Khan's ideas, which as an analyst, you have to allow yourself to be transformed by the clinical experience as much as the patient, quote unquote, benefits from it. You have to allow yourself to be transformed, especially at the level of knowledge. And I would say, I mean, that captures the principle as magnificently as anyone could formulate it, I would say. Yeah.
That's fascinating, because what it also, again, I know that we're running out of time, but this I cannot help. This is so fascinating because you and I were talking about this, Dany. It's actually once you start reading Lacan as an analysant, that is when you start perhaps like infused with the knowledge, or through that is how you recreate the clinic.
Yeah.
As you read it with the eyes of not a teacher, not the eyes of like a doctrinarian, so on and so forth, but with the eyes of first an analysant, and then once you start practice as an analyst. There's no other way, I think, that to read it, to learn, as you say, from the clinic, or to open yourself to the clinic in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's also for that reason that rather than adding a fourth pillar after I subtracted the institutional modality, I think that if there is something to be added, it's the application of one pillar. It's looking at the crossings, the confluences between the three modalities. That can only mean that when it comes to reading Lacan, yes, you have to allow yourself, much like in analysis, not to understand. Now we all know that it's not too difficult. You know, most of the time you don't understand anything anyway. Right? But it's not too difficult not to understand. But the irony is that there are still lots of people out there who think that, you know, when they have finally understood the écrit, that's the time when they will be able to practice. And I feel like saying, no, that's the time when you should go back into analysis.
True. Going back into analysis, I think on this note, we're going to end.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Dany.
Dany.
It is so vitalizing, and all your exuberance is very contagious. Thank you so much, and
Thank
everybody.
you.
Yeah, thank you so
You're
much.
very
Yes,
welcome.
thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dany.
So, thank you. Thank you, Juan Luis. So I will send my slides to Sanem, but also feel free to email me and I shall gladly pass them on to you. Thank you, my friends.